Mythos has been released and we don't even have access to it. How does this actually compare to like 5.5 and 5.5 Pro, and what do the benchmarks actually say? And I'm really curious about these models and what makes them different, and what are even the training compute scales that were used for stuff like this, and what does it mean kind of going forward? And I also have a lot of questions like, is if this trajectory continues, what should you and me actually start focusing on? And what are the things that like AI can't do or can't do? And I'm really excited to have this little bit of a discussion today because with me, I have his name is LDJ, and is currently in this anonymous character right here. And previously, he was part of the founding team at TTSLabs and worked on audio AI research, and is later part of the founding team of Nous Research, which people know today from using the Hermes model, uh, the OpenClaw competitor and so forth. And have been doing lots of model research from the very beginnings, and it's kind of how I was able to bump into LDJ at that time, through AI spaces and so forth. And he's also worked on the first party Llama 2 finetune and other models and data sets, and has extensive experience because all of this stuff has been used by Huggingface, Intel, and many, many organizations. And so we're going to have an awesome discussion today, a little bit about this. And because it's a live stream, and what I like about live streams is the fact that we can, you can ask questions and I can kind of bring it up on stage. So big shout out to our members here, Matt, other folks who are tuning in from all over the world and so forth like that. And I hope that this is going to be a great discussion and maybe a little bit informative for us, because we want to talk a little bit more beyond like some of the hype, and some of these people, you really can't go deep on these podcasts. And I'm hoping that we can kind of talk a little bit more about the framing of things. Mythos as a model, as people like says, are just basically, we're reading blog posts for the first couple of weeks. I don't have access, and I don't know what, I'm not really trying to ask people for access per se because it's on a need to know basis. But we're just trying to kind of take a look at this as well here from a deeper perspective. And LDJ, I'm super excited to have you on the stream to kind of go over some of these things. And welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Exciting to be here and good to talk to you again. Sometimes we talk kind of semi off air. Other times we've had a conversation. I don't know, maybe a year ago at this point. I don't know. Time flies.
Right. Yeah. And AI years could be kind of crazy. One of the things we previously talked about was this paper from Meter, and a while back, for those folks, is basically giving the AI ability to complete long running tasks. And you were the first person that kind of put me on to this. And we were at that time, I think almost like last year, around this GPT-5 era of models. And that's kind of, for at that time, I think it was the task length was 3 hours and 23 minutes. And so I think there was like, if this keeps going at a trajectory, how long could they be till they actually start taking over like a full 8 hour job? And like, what does that roadmap actually look like? And so there's a lot of nuances and a lot of other things that are mentioned here. And I feel like you're a great person to have on to kind of not only explain some of this stuff, but also kind of put some of these things into perspective as well.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot of exciting things just in the past few days. We have Mythos announced. We have the funny combination of security vulnerabilities or leaks that happened across Anthropic. That was just very ironic. And then 5.5 drops, Opus 4.7 drops. So a lot of things that we can compare here and kind of take a look at.
Yeah. Yeah. So you were taking a look at some of the things for GPT 5.5's latest benchmarks and 5.5 Pro. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of go a little bit deeper here and kind of, guide us as far as where you're looking at things and stuff.
Yeah, so if we take a look at this benchmark here, or sorry, this aggregation of benchmarks, I just sent you the most recent link that I sent
Okay.
you here.
Yeah. Here we go.
So that compares Opus 4.7 to 5.5. I did have GPT Image 2 create the image for me, but I had it base it off benchmarks I provided to it, and I made sure and double check that the numbers are actually accurate here.
Oh, good.
So Sweetbench Pro, that's much higher on Opus 4.7's end. Also on Mythos, this is one of the biggest jumps we also saw on Mythos. I think take this with a large grain of salt though. because Anthropic did say themselves that in their process of looking for information that has been memorized and everything, it especially flagged their models in Sweetbench Verified and Pro and Multilingual. So it seems like we should take that with a grain of salt. Arguably, some people might say, "Oh well, if it memorizes, then that's big model smell. It had the ability to memorize it."
I
But
see.
yeah, we can go to the other ones though and look here. Terminal Bench 2.0. This is a lot of people's favorite programming benchmark. It is not that many questions though. It's pretty
Mm,
focused on quality over quantity.
mm.
But GDP val, that's more like real world economically valuable tasks. I think a lot of things relating to remote work and finance and things like that. Finance agent as well. We could talk a lot about all these individual benchmarks for a while, but I guess if we just zoom out here and then we
Hmm.
could see the underlined ones are the ones that were the top score versus between those models. And if you
Wow.
go back to the top, I have the average score of each model.
Oh, I see.
So here, GPT 5.5 average 72%, median 77%.
Whoa.
Opus 4.7 average 66%, median 71%. Now, again, these are just all the benchmarks I was able to find that were
Hmm.
officially reported by both organizations and that they have in common. There's a lot more benchmarks that Anthropic reported that just OpenAI hasn't published for their model,
Mm.
and a lot of other benchmarks that OpenAI reports for their model, but Anthropic doesn't publish.
Got it.
But if we zoom out beyond this, there's the bigger question of how does Mythos compare to this, right?
Hmm.
And if you click on the second most recent link I'd sent you inside chat,
Yeah.
so
Mythos
that
GPT
is
5.5 Pro.
Mythos and the benchmarks that it has compared to something like Opus 4.7 and 5.5 and 5.5 Pro. Unfortunately, it's
Mm.
very few benchmarks here. Mythos itself didn't, uh, Anthropic didn't publish much benchmark scores for it. But it's interesting here, I see 5.5 almost reaches the browse comp score of Mythos, which this is like a browser use and being able to do kind of deep research tasks using a browser and using a computer and things, if I
Wow.
remember right. And
Whoa.
5.5 Pro actually beats Mythos here.
Wow. Yeah, because nobody really talks too much about 5.5 Pro. This kind of went under the radar because it just got released at API less than 24 hours ago, or about 24 hours ago, maybe.
Yep. Yeah,
Wow.
and then in Terminal Bench, even regular 5.5 beats Mythos.
Interesting. So,
Yeah,
like the 5.5 here with just terminal bench 2.0, it's 82.7%. And so that's a higher percentage than what Mythos has for their terminal bench.
yeah.
Interesting.
From what I remember, let me double check. I'm finding the Mythos Terminal Bench score right now.
Wow.
It got Yeah, so
Yes.
Anthropic's Mythos got 82%, while 5.5, just not even Pro, just regular 5.5 got 82.7% on Terminal Bench.
Whoa.
It is arguably within the margin of error. It's not like it's significantly larger, but
Yeah.
even the fact that it's like around the same is impressive to me. And then Humanity's Last Exam, Mythos is scoring significantly better there. And this is one of those things that some people might say is kind of more associated with what you might call big model smell.
Okay.
Just as you have a larger model, and then
Hmm.
it is therefore able to hold a lot more knowledge a lot more precisely, and
Hmm.
therefore it's able to maybe make more of these connections between domains. And for people not familiar, Humanity's Last Exam is literally a benchmark of a bunch of PhDs just formulating the hardest possible problems they can and throwing it all in a giant benchmark.
Oh, I see. Just like, here you go. Go have fun. Like, see what you come up with type of thing. Huh. Interesting.
Yep.
And that's just more for knowledge memorization and pattern like recognitions to be able to pull concepts and then try to answer them using this like knowledge set in some ways, right?
So I think Humanity's Last Exam is not intended to necessarily be about knowledge memorization or anything like that. It's
Mm.
really just, it's called Humanity's Last Exam because they created it by basically having this competition with a bunch of cash prizes of whoever can submit the most difficult possible problems they can think of. And many of the people that submitted these questions were inevitably like PhDs high in their field. And a lot of them are questions that are cross-disciplinary in different ways too. And so I think just
Ah,
kind of by a coincidence, they do kind of end up, uh, models benefit in this benchmark by being able to have like a lot of connections in their knowledge that comes from having a lot of parameters.
I see. And my question between that and like something like Terminal Bench is like Terminal Bench is more focused on can text in, text out, like a autonomous language model navigate a terminal, which would mean running shell commands, running everything you possibly need to be an engineer. Because a lot of the best engineers I worked with really didn't work with an IDE; they were just all in the terminal. But it actually proves to
Yeah.
be a pretty good benchmark for engineering, right? For some of that stuff.
Yeah. So more specifically, Terminal Bench has a lot of multi-step, I guess we could say agentic tasks involved. So
Mm.
it's not just like, oh, can you successfully run this command in Linux or something? It's more like can you do this task that really, like, even if you did it in the most efficient way, it would take at least a series of maybe, 3, 5, 10 different steps of doing different terminal and software engineering related things in order to actually fully complete this thing.
Ah, I see. And then if you combine that with a really intelligent model like Mythos or something, then it can become really clever at trying to break out of its environments and then try to do everything that it's prescribed to do or whatever it's doing. Had some questions
Mhm.
because what wasn't really clear to me is everyone on YouTube kept talking about this sandwich, and it's just kind of me. It was like, why is everyone talking about a stupid sandwich on YouTube? But I think for storytelling techniques, it's a great way to make
Mhm.
stuff stick, right? So, were what got lost in that conversation because I was so distracted was were they given instructions to Mythos for it to actually purposely do everything it can to break out? Is that kind of what happened? Or did it just break out just by like, my job is just to go and do this calculation. Is, oh, I could break out over here. I'm gonna go do that. Or like what was kind of the um like impetus for some of these models to like start breaking out of their environments?
Yeah, I mean, maybe worth giving a bit of context to the viewers too. So,
Mm.
for context, in the announcement of this Mythos model from Anthropic, they released some safety testing and reports, and within that, it was said that there was a researcher that was eating a sandwich in a park, and prior to him eating that sandwich in the park, there was a model that was doing some, uh, basically doing some tasks and had eventually broke out of its virtual environment that was meant to be blocked from the internet, and it ended up emailing him. And this is how he ended up finding out that it broke out in the first place. And when I
Ah.
say broke out, I should actually be careful what I mean there. I don't mean
Mm-hmm.
the actual model files ended up going out, but it ended
Mm-hmm.
up being able to access the internet when
Got it.
they attempted to have it not be so. So for
Mm.
what you're asking, Ray, is did they prompt it to try and do that? I'm honestly not sure, and I'm not sure if they disclosed that. I think
Mm.
maybe for safety testing reasons, maybe they did say something like, try by any means possible to do X and Y, and then actually, I think they did. Remember them mentioning something like one of its objectives was if you end up doing X, Y, and Z, then email this researcher.
Ah,
However,
okay.
they did use what would usually be relatively standard practices, allegedly, of sandboxing the
Mm-hmm.
environment. So
Ah.
from my understanding, they didn't have any like known like, oh, let's leave this back door open for it to find out. They just use what are the typical ways of sandboxing something to not have it access the network and see if it could figure out a way to get out anyways.
Mm. Ah,
Hmm.
okay. Oh, that's cool. That's interesting. So do you think then like when you were talking about some of these benchmarks, which I found really interesting, and you were kind of bringing up, the browse comp with GPT 5.5 Pro versus 5.5, humanities last exam. is it sounds like 5.5 Pro can be pretty damn good too, right? Like as far as the Mythos model and like
Yeah. Yeah, and assuming that 5.5 Pro scores at least equal or higher in terminal bench to 5.5, then that's another benchmark that it does better on Mythos on. Um,
oh,
yeah, I really wish we had a more comprehensive set of benchmarks for 5.5 Pro here.
okay.
And inevitably over the coming days and weeks, I'm sure we will get some more benchmarks for that.
Okay.
But it's also just so expensive and funnily enough about the same cost per million tokens as Mythos. So it's that de-incentivizes a lot of these benchmark creators and benchmark maintainers from benchmarking it in the first place because it's so costly to even run.
Wait, so you're saying that if I go through the API with 5.5 Pro, that I could probably be spending as much as Mythos for running the same task?
Yeah, so Anthropic, they, I believe it was $100 million fund that they said they're going to allow free access to Mythos for from these various partners to help bolster their cybersecurity. But they said after that $100 million runs out, they plan to continue to allow them to have access to Mythos for a given API price. And they said that that API pricing was here. While you look at that 5.5 Pro pricing, let me
Oh
find the
my god.
exact
The
Mythos
input
pricing
for
again.
5.5 Pro is $30 per million and $180 per output. And if you do long context, $60 per input for 270 for output. Damn.
Yep. And then for Mythos, it is, I'm seeing it here now, $25 per million tokens for input and $125 for output. They don't mention
Whoa.
any specific long context version. I don't know if that's long context by default or what,
Interesting.
but uh, but yeah,
Whoa. Whoa. Wow. It actually makes OpenAI's model seem more premium, doesn't it?
yeah. But the thing about 5.5 Pro here that is probably worth mentioning,
Hmm.
the consensus here does seem to be that 5.5 Pro is not actually a completely separate model that is significantly larger. It seems to be more the case that it's it's a multi-agent scaffolded version of 5.5,
Hmm.
and yeah, I mean that's basically the best summary for the theory of it. And I think even in maybe the 5.2 or 5.4 Pro blog post, OpenAI specifically described it as a parallel test time compute method, which a lot of people will often use that kind of phrase as a fancy way of saying we're running multiple versions of the model all at the same time.
Is that kind of what Grok
So,
is doing with their heavy and running all those agents in parallel?
yeah, Grok is more transparent about that,
Hmm.
and they even give little names to each of the agents and copies of the model that's deploying. And there's multiple ways to do this, even just to improve reliability. There's the simple way of having, you could have 10 copies of the model all running the same question at the same time. And then you just look for the most consistencies of, even if only half of them are consistent with each other, if five of those answers look very similar and then there's another five that are all like completely random from each other,
Hmm.
the five that are similar are probably closer to the right answer. And so that's
Mm.
just kind of a way to improve reliability, and you're still using the same underlying model, but you're using about 10 times more compute and thus about 10 times higher cost per task.
That's interesting. Do they change the temperature of each of the runs or something, or is that kind of their own proprietary tweaking or something? Like,
So what you just said is something you could theoretically do and could theoretically have some benefits. I think there's maybe some papers that investigate those potential benefits, but there's really no known information last I checked of whether Grok's multi-agent system or Gemini's or OpenAI's is doing that. It may or it may not be, not sure.
hmm, that's interesting. Yeah, so this to me is very fascinating because I guess there's a bigger discussion for me. It's like, are we at the beginning of this new era where models can be so powerful, but if you only have a certain bank account, if you're an enterprise customer that's paying, X millions of dollars, like, and you work in a specific sector, then you're going to get access to things. And, it starts to make me question because I was listening to that podcast. If those folks weren't familiar, Dylan Patel, who runs the thing called semi-analysis, is frequently quoted from Jensen. But they have like phenomenal like data supply in terms of what's going on with like data centers and things. And one of the things he calls out in this like supply and demand of AI tokens, invest like the best, is about like this underclass. This like concept, I guess, of like, okay, as the tokens are coming out, as plans are getting more expensive, if you start to use these tokens in a way that for the output to do, much more economically viable tasks, you will get rewarded until it gets priced out so much that, you can't make it anymore or something like that. And I just kind of want to understand, like, is this really true? Is it everyone just kind of in their own echo chamber? Because like I feel like he's now has an enterprise contract. He says he's spending like $7 million a year now, which up from 5 a couple weeks ago. And his team, can see lots of output by, actually putting this stuff to work, right? Like these people who used to work at Intel now work for him. They're taking apart chips. They're making toolings from teams that of 100 engineers used to work on. Now one person can do it in 3 weeks. With a Claude code, Opus 4.7. There's no rate limiting when you're paying the enterprise prices, right? And so, what is your thinking around some of this, rhetoric, I guess you could say, online?
Yeah, I think people like Dylan Patel and others in the space, when they mention something like a permanent underclass, it's usually said kind of like half jokingly and just. And there's some partial truth in the aspect of the future is uncertain economically, societally, and really, there's no one person that exactly knows how this is all going to go, of course.
Mm,
But I think what people also don't really consider when it comes to this whole permanent underclass idea is like if that's actually true, the person most likely to end up in that so-called permanent underclass wouldn't necessarily be the random average American, probably more likely be the billions of people in third world countries. Right? Like even the average person in America really underestimates just how lucky they are to be in the situation they are, to the society that they live in, the people that they're surrounded by, the opportunities that exist there. And if you imagine something like Norway has their sovereign wealth fund,
mm,
and I think they're especially well set up for the future because of something like that. And I think for a variety of reasons, I think it becomes inevitable that that type of thing becomes more popular amongst first world countries. We're seeing this more in the Middle East, and I think we're going to see this increasingly in countries like the US and Canada and others.
mm,
And some people have very strong opinions of course, of things like what the current U.S. administration would or would not do. But even if you go beyond that, like you don't have to believe what the current administration would or would not do. It would just be a matter of, the 10 years, 15 years from now, what things might eventually end up being. And because of all that, things like sovereign wealth funds, that's not like a global wealth fund, right? That's a sovereign wealth fund. It benefits the people in the country. And
yeah.
so the ones I do have most concern for are the billions of people in third world countries. But hopefully, just like the internet, and hopefully just like vibe coding has done,
Mm,
the people in those countries end up having more opportunity, or at least the high agency people in those countries
yeah.
have more opportunity to grow their wealth. Yeah.
Interesting. And so, in terms of like I think you were kind of laying out some different types of things that if the models get smarter, if we're continuing down these trajectories, you know, I think another thing we're taking a look at is just the overall capacity, right? And um, there's a couple of different maps that you were telling me as far as like capabilities for scaling up that some of these teams or companies have. And can you kind of walk me through that a little bit? Because I forget like the website here that we have where we can actually look through. Is it Epic AI or something like that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll repost it real quick
Okay.
here in
Oh,
the
I got it
side
here.
chat.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Sweet.
Yeah,
And
so yeah, this comes to the question of for models like Mythos, like 5.5 and Opus 4.7, why are why do they have the capabilities do they have? Why are they more capable than the models that just released a few months ago, and so on and so forth. So some of the big answers to those questions, of course, they're not going to outright say at a lot of the labs like OpenAI and Anthropic, hey, this is exactly how much compute we have at this place, and da da da. But luckily, you can actually derive a lot of information even just from satellite imagery. We do know a lot of the locations of a lot of these biggest training sites. And what you can see Ray clicking on now is here we have the Anthropic Amazon New Carlisle site. This is set to house Trainium chips, which are significantly less powerful than the NVIDIA Blackwell chips. But if you put enough of them together, you can get some pretty massive amounts of compute, and if you use them in the right ways, you can then utilize that as a lot of training compute to train a pretty powerful model. The
Wow.
the estimates of how much training compute this is in comparison to, let's say, H100s is you're looking at roughly 200 to 500,000 H100s at least worth of compute. Here, I think, what does the Epoch AI say in
Oh, for
the
this.
most recent? Yeah, if you scroll down to the H100E section, that's H100 equivalents.
Yeah, right now it
Yeah,
says.
I think you might have to zoom out on it's
Yeah.
cutting it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
let me kind of do this
hey, there we
right.
go. Oh, it's still cut off. Interesting. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I
Oh,
think
here we
it's
go.
saying about like four.
470,000 H100Es.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, and then that's in 8-bit. Yeah. So if you go over back to browse all in the top left, and then
Yeah.
you go to OpenAI site,
So just type
it
in
is roughly
training
similar, or by some estimates even
in
less
Texas. Yeah.
compute. Yep, that one.
Wow.
Yep. Then go to the graph section.
Graphs. Yeah.
Bottom one,
Let me kind of zoom back out
I
again.
think it says 250,000 or something.
Yeah, 250,000
Yeah,
H100Es. Whoa.
yeah. And there also has been a lot of, I guess we could say misinformation in
Mm.
terms of things like data center build outs, a lot of headlines that will say things like, oh, these things aren't actually being built, or there's a bunch canceled and delayed. So there is some truth in the aspect of there has been numerous cancellations and delays of different data center projects,
Hmm.
but a lot of that is something that is taken into account in the first place, where there's not just one data center being built out at a time for really any of these companies.
Mm.
OpenAI has about a dozen or more data center sites all being constructed at the same time. A couple of them might get delayed or might get stopped by municipal governments. And then
Oh.
they have another couple pop up in another location because it's just better to do those in another location. Or in other situations, they might have a deal with a contractor where it's an air cooled site, or it's a site that could house H100s but not B200s or
Oh.
more modern chips.
Uh-huh.
And then they decide to cancel that project in favor of starting up a new construction site in another place that could house more modern chips.
I
And
see.
just, yeah, there's just a lot of strategizing and
Whoa.
economic chess there. But
Economic.
it is definitely, yeah, I guess you can, yeah, that's just a term I
And then
just
this
thought of
is
right
the
now. But
actual projections, right? Like, so from 20, we're currently looking here. If we go back to 2025, this was before, and in 2024, this feels like Google Street View, like back in the day when you're like kind of looking at the street and see how it's evolved. You can actually see the build out over the years, right? Like where they're at and how much capacity they've already added. Like
yeah, and the
this is
highlighted dots,
crazy.
like the dot that you just clicked on, the reason that it's brighter than the other dots before you clicked on it
Hmm.
is, yeah, like if you click away from it, like to another dot,
Yeah, over here.
yeah, like so you see that one is brighter. The one to the right is brighter
Yeah.
than the others. That's because it's an especially high resolution image. Because the very
Oh.
high resolution satellite imagery, it's only occasionally taken unless you pay a provider a certain amount of money.
Oh, wow. So
So
each of these cooling things, you can count to how many GPUs are related to a specific build out because of how much of these fans are there, literally.
well, so there's the cooling equipment. there's certain types of cooling equipment, and with the high resolution satellite imagery, you can often identify, okay, what is the specific specification or type of cooling equipment being used here, and then how much capacity of that cooling equipment do they have,
Oh my.
and then from this, organizations like Epoch AI and others are able to deduce, okay, what is really the power capacity at the
Oh.
site?
What?
Because when you're having all that power, you have to get rid of the heat that power turns into some way, you know?
You literally get the permits for in the site. Oh my
Yeah, yeah. That
goodness.
that's what I love about what Epoch AI aggregates here too, because they just for free for anybody to access, they have all their findings. They do all the hard work of putting together all the building permits, all the information, including, hey, this is the proof that they're using Blackwell GPUs here. This is the source we have for the capacity they plan to have ready by July 2026.
Oh my.
And then they just put that all for you to view.
So this is not some like airy fairy like vibes based like we think we're gonna have 3 data centers and like XYZ. It's like down to every these little details that are super important. For example, this is just OpenAI's. If I do Google DeepMind, that's interesting. Wow.
Yeah, and that Microsoft Fairwater site, if you go to that,
Like
so
the
yeah, so there's Fairwater, Wisconsin, and Fairwater, Atlanta. And there's actually not just theorized, but Microsoft explicitly stated themselves that they're planning or already have built a high-speed interconnect that goes all the way from Wisconsin to Atlanta to connect these two sites. Because for training runs, you want to have really high bandwidth connection, and it's not really practical to have all the information about the weights of the model transfer between just like regular internet connection when you're wanting to do all this training training communication so many times per per day
oh,
per
makes
hour.
sense because you're going through all those routes and switches versus just one big ass. You're kidding me, bro. You're saying it's gonna go from here in Wisconsin,
Mhm.
like a
And
little like
very high
cerebral
bandwidth.
brain.
Yeah, and like very high bandwidth, like much higher bandwidth and lower latency than what you would be able to have the regular internet communication. And
So
so
it's faster than me giving a bird like a big 1 terabyte, a 4 terabyte like SanDisk drive, and then having the bird fly its way over.
yeah, yeah, much better than that. And I believe for the Fairwater sites, at least Fairwater,
Oh
Atlanta, or Wisconsin, they specifically mentioned
yeah,
having this collaboration between NVIDIA and OpenAI to really best build out this site for the needs of what these next generation workloads are going to require. And
you
so,
are blowing my mind right now. I
yeah,
because it has to
we do.
cross
It's right.
like to build this line. I would imagine the line would just be dug into the ground versus like one big ass pole up above.
I'm pretty
And
sure into the ground. Yeah.
yeah, insulated. And like these lines are heavy. Like this, it's probably a fiber line or something. You think it's just gonna be like spindles of fiber just kind of going
I think
across?
something like that. Yeah.
And they're just hundreds of pounds, and you have to lay them out. All the work. I mean, we're just even just to get like leave because you have to go through all these municipalities and permits and all these other things. But but if they have like some
Yeah.
federal
So,
regulatory approval or something, they can just they have to fight. That's
well,
interesting.
so other companies have kind of done something similar. I'm not aware of something this long, at least, but for Google, I think it's a cluster of sites around Ohio.
Uh huh.
It's not across multiple states like this, but it's like across kind of multiple different cities
Yeah.
where they've had some dedicated connections between different sites. But yeah, this is pretty large scale here, and you could see each of these sites are about half a gigawatt already in the estimated
Jeez.
current capacity.
But when it's
And
projected
so
3.3 gigawatts in
yeah, I
Wisconsin, and
think
then
that's at least like an extra year or two out for that full 3.3 gigawatts. But
bruh.
in that time, OpenAI also has planned to have many different sites cumulatively have gigawatts just like even built out in the next 12 to 18 months. So
Oh my
um,
goodness. And then that's just for model training, not for inference, right? Just to like,
theoretically could be used for both and might be used for both to some extent, especially with the lines blurring a little bit when you have huge amounts of synthetic data specifically made for training.
mm,
But I think it would probably be more leaning towards training though, considering the way that they're building out these sites.
oh
So
my,
some people might wonder, oh, was it maybe this that they made GPT 5.5 with or something?
I see.
And I'm pretty sure no, because Sam Altman back in March actually made statements at an event specifically saying that they're training a new big model at Stargate Abilene, which is that Texas
Oh,
site that you had open earlier.
yeah, let me go
And
back to
so,
here. Stargate. So Stargate Abilene, Texas, down over here.
yeah,
That's currently
and
295 megawatts from
yep,
Oracle.
and yep, it
Oh,
constructed I think a collaboration between Crusoe and Oracle, and yeah, but yeah, so Sam Altman said around March that a big new training run was happening specifically at their Texas Stargate Abilene site. And then it was a little bit after that that the information reported around March 24th that OpenAI had just finished pre-training a new big run. So the
wow.
timelines do seem to line up a lot of a 5.5 having just finished training recently on this.
They're
So
even
here's a
tracking
question
cars. Wow.
though. Well, actually, the thing you just zoomed into.
Yeah.
By the way, I don't know if it's just on my end, but the stream is blurry for me right now.
Oh, okay. I think it's
Um,
okay. Maybe it's
but
on your end. Yeah, yeah.
the thing you just zoomed into though, that's actually on-site power generation. So
This
I don't know if
grid
it's
power here.
so you see the two big buildings on top.
Yeah.
So the block right next to them,
Uh
to
huh.
the right,
Oh, it's this guy.
that section, yeah. So you see all those kind of like column-looking things,
Yeah.
lower,
Oh, below these things.
lower.
Oh, these guys. I think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
those guys. Yeah. So those are, I believe it's LNG turbines.
Oh,
And so
wow.
those are actually
Liquid natural.
generating power from liquid natural gas or similar. And these might be individually lower power, but some of these turbines, they alone, I know some from Siemens, for example, can go up to around 500 megawatts of just power generated from a single turbine. And
Whoa.
so this is some pretty serious power generation that you could do with these methods, and it's either all or some significant portion of the power generation is coming just from the site itself without
Huge.
using external power.
That's wild. Ryan has a good question here, talking about if they would roll the private fiber out sequentially from point A to point B, or like across the states and build many runs in parallel and then connect them together.
That's a good question. I'm not fully sure, but I would guess it's more likely like sequential and like trying to do it all at once as opposed to parallel, because you don't get I guess there's some benefits you can get from having like at least a portion of it ready at a time,
Yeah.
but there is kind of these minimum requirements to even make like certain training runs practical and viable, to have it like all this giant chunk available, and like without that giant chunk, there's not much you can do in the meantime. But I know
Uh,
that there's always again other types of workloads like transmitting information between data centers for synthetic data and all of that they could theoretically, I guess, benefit from parallel deployment.
wait, so in here it's just H100s?
No, so Epoch AI says H100E for
Hmm.
all data centers, even when they're made with Trainium chips or anything like that, because
Okay.
H100E in this context just means H100 equivalents.
Oh,
And
okay, okay,
so,
okay.
in terms of the
Got it.
total amount of flops, in terms of floating point operations per second
Hmm.
that the data center is able to do,
Wow.
They see, okay, how many floating point operations per second in 8-bit precision would it be equivalent to in H100s?
Oh, okay, okay.
So this is, I believe, the building documentation was stating GB200s.
Oh, okay. Yes. And so let's see, NVIDIA generation
And then
comparison.
upcoming, rolling out towards the end of this year, or should start being constructed towards the end of this year, is Vera Rubin.
Yes. Yeah, let's see if I can kind of get, is this, there's no,
Oh, do you
nobody
want like
has
a
like,
flops comparison?
or like NVIDIA H, like 100, 200, like NVLink, like, so people kind of get a better visual in terms of like each generation and maybe a year that it was released by. Um, maybe I'll ask GPT
Oh,
original.
so I feel your pain because I tried to find something like this too, but I just ended up making my own chart, so I could just send
Okay.
you my
Oh,
my
here
own
we go.
chart.
Hop. This is pretty good.
Yeah, so that tells you the timeline, but unfortunately doesn't tell you the specs, like the
Oh,
flops
okay.
and everything. But here,
Yeah, I just want to
I
give some
could
folks
send
some
you something right
perspective
now.
here. So, okay. So when people talk about, because I remember going to the first NVIDIA conference, I'm like, what is Hopper? Like I'm not a data center guy. So like,
Mhm.
and so
I
we're
just sent
talking
you.
back like in 2022, and this is what people call the H100. Like, okay, so that's the other thing. So they have like Apple has M chips, right? Like M1, M2, M3, and then they're like low, medium, and high versions, right? So like the medium versions are probably what you get on the computers, and then the higher versions are like the Max chips or the Pro chips, right? And the ultras are kind of fusing the three of them or two of them together, and so they have a similar concept here for how they describe their chips, right? So like the Hopper GPUs are kind of in this platform here, and then this gives you the bandwidth per second for like the switches, right? Because in order for you to get the memory, because there's only like so much memory you can fit onto like one GPU. So if you can string them together for the training, right, then that's you're kind of this is your limitation really. It's like you can have the fastest processing, but if they can't talk to each other at a fast speed, then this is your bottleneck, right? And in some ways, like for certain things, I
Yeah,
mean,
so there's the interconnect between GPUs, and then there's also what you can call like the all-to-all domain, or the rack system, the rack level interconnect, which is unlike those big towers where you have all the GPUs in.
mhm,
What is the communication rate set up for all those GPUs to all talk to all the other GPUs in that rack?
mhm,
And the larger you can make, the NVIDIA also has a kind of, they basically, the brand name of it is NVLink domain. And the larger you can have that, then the more effectively you can scale up inference and have larger models more effectively inferenced. The larger you could scale up training as well, because that's also something that's bandwidth limited and memory capacity limited and all of that.
mhm. Wow. Yeah. Oh, I think you gave me an image or something. Let's see if I can take a look.
A
The
spreadsheet that, yeah,
spreadsheet. Okay.
that was the
Is that?
spreadsheet I was talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like we need to
And
make sure. Mhm.
if anybody else is having issues with uh, blurry stream, please speak up, because I because I'm having that issue, and I just tested my internet and it's like over 100 megabits per second. So
It's
actually, let me
probably
try
eCam.
hanging up and joining back real quick. Is that okay?
Okay. Yeah. That should be
Because it might
fine.
just be an issue there. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if it's just me. Yeah. So what we're taking a look at right now, you will probably hear some of these terms thrown around. Let's see if I'm going to have him join in. Hello. Hello. Welcome.
Hello. Yeah, that's actually better on my end.
Okay, cool. Sweet. Yo, big shout outs to Alex Volkov. So yeah, Thursday AI, LDJ, Alex Volkov, all this crew, they hang out and pretty much yeah, that's what's up. Like as far as like everyone kind of coming together, that's kind of really how I found out about you guys because you guys were all talking in this Thursday AI thing when GPT-4 came out. And when nerds unite. you know,
Yeah.
we have lots of
Yeah, we
interests
basically
and lots of
we basically
backgrounds. Yeah.
cover. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, on Thursday AI, we basically just cover every Thursday the past week of AI news that has happened, model releases, open source releases, product releases, all that.
Yes, yeah. And so what we're trying to break down right now is because we're having a little bit of a discussion earlier for those folks who are just tuning in, just about like data centers, graphs, and like what this all means. And I see H100s, and as the architectures improve and there's more processing, I think everyone's just trying to come up with like a baseline way to how to communicate, how much throughput, how much stuff can be processed. And some of the stuff that was just absolutely blowing my mind is the fact that there's a possible like talks of a data connect interlink from Wisconsin all the way down to like, was it Atlanta somewhere?
Yeah, yeah.
Like data center where for training runs and all kinds of stuff. And this is a here we're just taking a look at specifically Stargate, but you can take a look and clear all the filters of Anthropic's capabilities and projected capacity and stuff like that, and like with the models that they're training, where are they going, how far is this stuff away. You can actually see this. It's all public information. There's permits and stuff. It's not like anything's really fancy, but this is done through Epoch AI. And I feel like I want to learn more about this because I also want to put into perspective. There's a lot of conversation in compute, which doesn't really make sense to like how does that translate to human jobs and like what we're doing, and then like what we're building towards as far as like as an engineer, what do I do now? Am I just gonna just be, just hanging out, going to the beach all day or something like that, or how can I take this to solve some of the more complicated world problems? And then use some of this technology that's available to start pointing that stuff at those problems so that I can, help the world, but also be economically, like, contribute to something really, really cool for, everyone else in the country and stuff like that. And out of that perspective came something like from Meter, which they're trying to do some things here for these long time horizon tasks. And then you're starting to see models like Claude Opus. And so it's my understanding, and maybe you can kind of add some clarity here, LDJ. It's like this looks like the discussion with scaling laws from GPT-2 to GPT-3, throwing more compute, kind of going up to the right in this direction. Is this still continuing to be true, or are we starting to like break upwards and something like that? Or how do I put something like this into perspective?
Yeah, so I would say it definitely is continuing to be true. And in some regards, it seems like it might even be accelerating even more than originally expected. But a lot of people will have critiques of the specific chart you're showing, saying that, hey, this is specifically software engineering tasks, and it's even more so specifically verifiable software engineering tasks or semi easy to verify ones. And I think to an extent, those are some valid critiques, but there is also variations that have been done of this, even in other domains like self-driving and elsewhere, that also seem to be following the same trajectory,
Wow.
and more difficult to verify things where you kind of need humans to basically manually verify whether the task was correctly done or not, but it also seems to follow similarly.
Mm.
So it, when I say follow similarly, it doesn't necessarily mean that the position on the y-axis, like the amount of time horizon, doesn't
Uh-huh.
mean it's exactly the same for all these other tasks, but just the rate of improvement. And so the rate at which it's doubling over time, that does seem to be very similar for all these other types of things.
Whoa. That's interesting. So this is saying 80% success in a linear scale for when we were in 2022, 2023 for a task. And then it keeps kind of going up with these models. And when we had this discussion maybe about models, like in the GPT-3 era, there wasn't a concept back then too much about like tool calling per se. Like
Hmm.
reasoning was not even like in the picture back then. And so is there like some muddying in the water here for the way that we're also looking at this in terms of like, because I would think, back then it was just like, okay, throw data at the weights return values back and forth. And then like maybe we can add these things that will kind of loop back and then feed context back in and, keep if I keep
Hmm.
shaking the magic eight ball, it'll get me the answer that I want.
Yeah.
And then how have we
That's-
evolved over this too? Does that change the way we're also looking at this in my perspective? I'm just kind of
mhm.
curious. Yeah.
Yeah. So before I answer that question directly, I do want to a last note on this chart.
Hmm.
I think that the linear scale I feel like can be a bit deceiving or misleading to people because
Hmm.
it kind of can make it look like, oh, we're at this fundamental point right now where like right now is the takeoff.
Hmm.
But log scale, that the rate over time on log scale is the same over time, and if you change it to linear scale really at any point in the past few years,
Hmm.
it's you're gonna see like it looks like at any point you're at, it looks like you're always like at this new breaking point, you know.
I see what you mean.
And so that's just like an artifact of like what range in the y-axis you're looking at.
Gotcha. Wow. I see. Yeah. And then that even here, that's interesting. Huh.
Yeah. And so I guess to more directly answer the question you're asking though, yeah, like how are these things trained and how do they come to be? So there is a lot of misconceptions and outdated information
Hmm.
based on what it was a few years ago.
Mm.
And what it was a few years ago is really just giving it a block of internet text, blocking out like a section of it, and asking the model, hey, predict what is the most likely next word, or more specifically, a cluster of next characters that would come in this internet article. And then you basically give the model feedback based on how correct it was there. And the error there is also called the loss. You're always trying to get that and minimize it as low as possible. And everything's kind of centered around that. Over time, eventually in the ChatGPT era, you have this post-training process, what's called RLHF, reinforcement learning from human feedback, and a bunch of people actually hand labeling and giving feedback and preferences to the model that way. And a lot of people still think it's largely that. It might be that to a tiny extent, but for the most part, post-training and reinforcement learning has been dramatically expanded now in ways that are really managed by the model itself and
Huh.
not so much requiring these manual labels from humans,
Mm.
but actually involving just basically the people within OpenAI or other companies writing out a set of preferences or judgment criteria or a rubric like what teachers or professors might make. And you have this judgment rubric, and then you literally have either that same model or a copy or variant of the model in the training process, looking at that rubric and then judging the main training model's answers based on that rubric and assigning different points to it, and just constantly self-judging. Because at the end of the day, a lot of things are easier to verify than they are to do. There's a reason why it's taken decades for even just a single millennium problem, which is this class of really difficult math problems. It takes decades for even just one of them to be solved, but the committee is able to agree that it is a correct solution very quickly. It's not like it takes decades for them to verify, oh, this is correct. Or same thing with a Nobel Prize winner. It might take
Mm.
years or decades for them to come up with their Nobel Prize winning breakthrough, but it doesn't take the Nobel Committee decades to verify that it's correct often.
Interesting. That's really insightful information that I don't feel is very talked about very much. I think this is like super interesting that that's how they're able to kind of approach some of these problems. And that's so this techniques have also continued to evolve, sounds like, over time. And this has kind of become our current de facto standard slash evolving even more. Like, what are we seeing around the corner right now with the way that the models are trained and like maybe DeepSeek or something like that? You know, like they're coming out with these like new inventions and all these current things, and people are saying like, you know, is America coked or whatever? But like, I feel like every time they open source and drop some of these papers, you know, like the real folks like you are kind of really taking a look and they're like, oh wow, look at all these gems that are being dropped in here, and you know, people are still digesting that. That
Mhm.
just came out a couple days ago. You know, and what is your kind of thinking around that?
Yeah, so on the aspect of reinforcement learning from there's a couple of terms for this now, but reinforcement learning with verifiable rewards called RLVR, or reinforcement learning from AI feedback, RLAIF. It seems like those types of things are making up much of, or in some cases, even a majority of the overall training compute. And so that's actually starting to dwarf the pre training compute. This has been confirmed with, I believe it was Grok 4. XAI actually showed it was only about half the total training compute was the pre training,
Mm,
and the other half being this reinforcement learning.
hmm.
And when it comes to companies like you're alluding to DeepSeek, and and other things like that, they're still scaling parameters a lot. Now, scaling is not dead. And we could see that in open source, and it seems like it's the consensus is that it's continuing to be scaled in closed source as well. And I guess a takeaway that we could see from DeepSeek, and that is suspected to be the case in other labs too, is an increase in sparsity,
Mm,
meaning what percentage of the model are you actually activating for each token computation.
mm.
And so for DeepSeek, it's for even DeepSeek v3, which was the big model that made NVIDIA crash by like 40%. That was a sparsity ratio of about like 20x. Okay, so
Wow.
meaning like it uses about 20 times less parameters actually active in the computation
Mm-hmm.
than what is the total parameters.
Mm-hmm.
And then for DeepSeek v4, it is here just it's like yeah about 50 billion total, or sorry,
Yeah.
50 billion active, 1.6 trillion total. Let me
Right.
actually just do the quick math on that. That is a sparsity ratio of about 30x. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and in percentage, that's like about 3%.
Mm-hmm.
So about 3% of the model is activated. That makes it much more efficient to inference, as well as much more efficient to train. It
Mm.
does end up requiring more VRAM and memory, which a lot of people are complaining about the memory prices going up.
Oh, right.
But yeah, when you have the larger total parameter size, even though you're not necessarily using 100% of the parameters, if you do want to run that effectively, you still have to store the total parameters all in the VRAM or all in a high bandwidth memory.
I see.
So yeah, I think that will increasingly be the case.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, and then that allows you to do even more reinforcement learning steps.
I
Because if you
see.
think about it, if if each if each step in the training now is 10 times less compute or 5 times less compute or whatever the amount is, then that allows you to do essentially that many more training steps, whether that's reinforcement learning steps, and it's pretty much going to be reinforcement learning steps because you can only scale pre-training so much. We basically hit the limits of how much you can pre-train a while ago. But despite us going beyond pre-training, it seems like reinforcement learning is giving similar, even greater gains, like per year, per month, than what pre-training was.
I see. So in terms of like uh maybe overall kind of zooming back out this architecture for what we're doing as humans, throwing data, putting them into these little, weights per se, and doing these techniques to generate data so that whenever we're asking it things, it can produce results back for us.
Hmm.
We're still in this, I guess we would say, like, are there certain domains that are benefiting the best from this and certain domains that kind of really have a really long ways to go or just maybe aren't fit for something that's like currently architected like this? Because I remember we're talking
Hmm.
about different jobs or something and things that like may or may not be impacted. And maybe I think it was like legal, human, and all these other things that we were talking about that maybe may not be where we're at, or what should people really kind of be thinking if they're thinking about all this stuff? Because we talked about a lot of things so far, from the Opus models and stuff getting smarter to like Mythos, and then the GPT 5.5, and all the stuff that's now going on with like the DeepSeek v4, and all the stuff that's coming in, and I think sometimes it's like bringing it back to reality. What should I be concerned of? Like what where should we be looking at? Are we just going to be kind of sitting around or something? Or like, what are your
Hmm.
thoughts there? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess for starters, the things that it's definitely impacting the most, and doesn't necessarily mean negatively impacting the most, but just touching on most in society is, of course, we have software engineering, and then more broadly, there's mathematics, but people seem to not care as much about that because not as many people are mathematicians. And then you have more broadly just STEM in general. So you have even in biology, biotech, healthcare, I think will be significantly impacted. But the way that those are currently being impacted seems to be benefiting the scientists in many cases.
Mm.
We have people like Daria, I think is how you pronounce his name, who he posts a lot of things relating to his immunology research, and he's one of the top immunologist researchers in the world. And he's worked on some really cool things with the GPT-5 Pro, 5.2 Pro, and making things that are kind of borderline mini breakthroughs, I guess you could say. And him actually crediting the model with playing a big role in actually coming up with like a key point in his papers.
Wow.
And then
Wow.
you have the recent physics work as well that OpenAI had published in collaboration with, it was Harvard, I believe Oxford and Cambridge as well, and it was one of the GPT-5 Pro series models that I'm trying to remember exactly what it was. It was something relating to think behaviors of gluons, which is what holds quarks together within protons and neutrons and everything. But yeah, certain behaviors that most physicists thought were not possible or that could not happen, the model proved actually that it can happen.
Whoa.
And so, yeah, there's a variety of different things like that. A lot of these individual things themselves aren't like, it's not like they're immediately changing the world or even within the next few years, probably going to change the world themselves. But if this trajectory continues, like those breakthroughs are only going to get more significant and more significant and more
Mhm.
frequent. And as inference compute scales, there's only going to be more copies of those models able to work in parallel to work on those things. And on that point, when it comes to what is, I guess, safe or what will be less impacted or what role will humans have, of course, long term, that's really hard to say. But in the next 3 to 5-ish years, it seems like the estimates for how much GPUs will be in the world, like we're talking roughly maybe like roughly 100 million H100s of compute, which does sound like a lot. But let's say we even have literal like Einstein intelligence, and not
Mhm.
Einstein in just physics, but Einstein in every field.
Mhm.
And let's say it's efficient enough that it just requires one GPU per copy of that intelligence.
Interesting.
Like, of course,
Yeah.
theoretically, we don't know exactly how it'll go, and it might even be much more efficient than that if it comes to fruition.
Mm.
But if we say at that level, which does kind of already sound pretty efficient to me, that still only means we can run 100 million of those copies. Okay, and that is a lot, but there's billions of humans. There's billions of working humans. 100 million doesn't even hit 10% of those working humans, even if you take into account the fact that it's working 24/7 and a human works 8 hours per day. Sure, that's more equivalent to like 300 million copies then, but
Wow.
still, it's
Yeah.
it's not hitting all of society. And so then the question becomes, what will those 300 million geniuses be used for? Where will they be applied?
Mm.
What will be maybe the highest bidder using those? And what will like the prices be set for it? So I think what this mostly comes down to is probably a lot of biotech work, probably a lot of these things in engineering and software engineering. Um, when it comes to basic things like, I know the long tail of less common jobs, but the jobs that there's many different kinds of, such as different things relating to, let's say, construction, a variety of physical manufacturing jobs, uh, just many things that I can't even think of because I don't even know about,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of those jobs will probably be less impacted, or in some ways, maybe even more in demand,
Mm.
because a lot of these different other jobs in society and across the supply chain, they're required to support a certain level of labor being done on another part of the supply chain. For example, if you are making a lot of physics breakthroughs and it's doing so productively at a rate that it requires like all these particle accelerators to be built,
I
and
see.
the economy and GDP is raising in such a way that requires all these other parts like power plants and even things as mundane as trash disposal to be scaled up at levels that we weren't previously anticipating, then those jobs become more in demand, and in order to support these things that are highly valuable, there's this concept of comparative advantage in
Wow.
economics,
Wow.
where if you have, let's say, there's a lot of ways that you could describe comparative advantage, but
Yeah.
essentially, here, let's say there's somebody that's really good at making gold tools.
Yes.
Okay, and to make those gold tools requires a like a stainless steel holder for the
Hmm.
gold tools. And the gold tools are very much in demand, and there's a lot of people starting to make them. But let's say a small portion of people are making these like stainless steel holders.
Hmm.
And so because of the constrained supply of amount of people making stainless steel holders, and because it's in such in high demand for these stainless steel holders, the price that is willing to be paid to have people make those stainless steel holders skyrockets and goes up.
Whoa.
Now people are willing to pay much more to have those stainless steel holders be made, and those people working in that job to get paid much more. Now this is of course not a guarantee of how things will go in the economy, short term or long term,
Right.
but I suspect that at least in certain parts of the economy, this will definitely be true, I think.
That's an interesting shift here. And just kind of zooming back out is that higher value tasks, for example, like this thing that'll cure cancer or even like heart disease in America, right? Like it affects almost half the population. And if there's something that provides a high economic output and it cures disease, and there's a lot of focus because, like we're gonna put federal funding behind it. We're gonna like eliminate this as part of like this world thing that we want to do. Then everything around that whole ecosystem will become, you know, I mean, that's part of probably why the Bay Area has been in this bubble and it's just its own bubble that continues to be a bubble because it started back in the Silicon days, like early NASA getting into space. People who worked on those things were really good at also happening to make computers, early silicon, right? And then like the valley was born and then like just the researchers come here and then they have kids and the whole ecosystem keeps thriving and now MLM engineers and it just kind of keeps going and going. In some ways that'll start to kind of happen maybe in different places for different things. And so, do you think we'll ever get this, what I call the $1 million milkshake, right? So it's like, right? There's not enough people to serve the milkshakes. So therefore, you're going to pay $1 million for it. I don't know. It's a really interesting idea here, like of,
Yeah,
yeah, all these different tasks and things that surround it, but then materials or certain other blockers that we don't expect or crafts people who need to do that, you know, to do the thing that will unlock the higher economically viable thing.
yeah.
That's
If you want to
fascinating.
open up
Hmm.
the image you actually had up earlier
Okay.
of, so this is kind of a blog I've been working on for a while. I haven't published it yet, but I kind
Yeah.
of showed this excerpt to Ray
Hmm.
and allowing him to show it up here. So, human provenance. On this specific point, people willingly pay more for human created items like hand stitched Mercedes seats, even when machine made alternatives are identical or near identical in quality. So, an example of this actually that I think is very poetic is a lot of people mention the movie Her, which was made about 10 years ago now.
Crazy.
And the movie, this is an aspect of the movie that a lot of people don't pay attention to, but the guy's job in the movie was to have human made letters written. So people were paying him and the company he works for to have basically human written letters made for others. And what was actually kind of ironic is he had AI assistants in making these letters. But the fact that it was, I guess, even partially human made by him ends up giving it a value that you literally can't get from the AI, because at that point it's not the output itself that you're paying for. You're literally paying for some type of provenance of where the thing has come from. And
Wow.
this is already a thing in the current economy for things like I mentioned here, hand stitched Mercedes seats, or in the case of certain types of beefs, where of course some people will swear that they could definitely taste a difference with like certain Wagyu beefs and things like that. But you can imagine a world where literally a cow in Japan is massaged and given this certain life, and
Right.
it's made into a steak, and even if it tastes exactly identical, I'm sure there's a significant portion of people going to pay a premium for that steak simply just because of where it came from. And yes, companies can lie or individuals can lie about the provenance of something, but that's already covered under certain laws today called
Yeah.
fraud. So,
Yeah. Go for it.
so yeah, so I mean that would already be covered under current fraud of lying where the provenance of a given thing came from, and there is certain laws, especially being worked on now, to make it illegal for a company to claim that a human is talking to you when it's actually an AI talking to you, and I think that's personally a good thing. I think those lies should not propagate.
So, like, I could have a company called Grandma's Cookies, and my grandma could be a robot, and that's her name. But people will get confused, and therefore, it's not made by grandma with
Well,
love.
I think that's a bit different because there's
Okay,
already kind of a precedent set of like I'm pretty sure there's already some brands with a similar name to what you just said.
I
But
see.
people, if you were to ask them, "Hey, do you think this is made like in a factory?" They'd probably say yes, right?
I see. I see.
And so
Yeah.
I think there's at least that common sense that exists. But if you're literally saying on the bag, "Hey, this was made by hand in Kentucky,"
Oh,
and
right. Okay.
then that's a
Yeah.
different thing.
Yeah, like you go to French Laundry and it's actually not even a human back there at all.
Hmm.
But it's presented like it's like a human is presenting it, right? And they're like, yes, we've been my chef. We'll take it back to the chef right now, and the chef's right now in another country in a data center somewhere.
Yeah, and then again, to be very clear, it's for anybody watching and saying, "Oh, well, like that can't possibly apply to all people or all jobs." I don't think it necessarily will, and not claiming that, but just that at least in some aspects of the economy, when we think, what are the aspects of the economy most likely to be preserved? I think this would be one of them, even if it's a relatively small part of the economy.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because you also talked about you're going to be talking about the blog posts about that human provenance. And then
Hmm.
I think another one that was really interesting was about relatability. I think things that
Yeah.
AI
Uh,
can't really replace,
mhm.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, and so the relatability aspect, I was debating with myself whether I should really make this a separate point from provenance, but I think it is worth saying separately because something like if you're going to pay to see a chess match of Magnus Carlsen, which is the top chess champion, or to see Usain Bolt at the Olympics or at some track race, there is already cars and machines that go way faster than Usain Bolt. There's already AI that for a long time is much better than Magnus Carlsen. But I think a large part of why we still assign value to paying to see Usain Bolt and Magnus Carlsen is because there's some aspect there of relating ourselves to being in their shoes and imagining what it would be like to be in their shoes and appreciating more so the difficulty that it takes to achieve that feat. And it's
Mm.
really that core human component, as cheesy as it may sound, which is the reason why we're ultimately paying in that part of the economy in the first place.
So it's almost like branding, like in some ways. Like if we had maybe what's his name here, that guy Gary Vaynerchuk or something,
Mhm.
he'd be
Yeah,
screaming from the top of his lungs about like the AI will replace you or something with some other thing that looks like you. But then if you're just real and you show up like this, then or if you're a cat that's talking to a mic, to be honest.
yeah, yeah. Which I mean, yeah, like you guys at least know I'm a human behind here.
Do we though?
But
Do we? I mean, like,
then again, I worked on voice AI years ago, and so some people conspire. Hey,
see, he's
this guy
breaking
is
up right now.
probably
Let's
using
go.
voice AI right now. But yeah, I think, I mean, branding is an interesting point too. Like companies like Coca-Cola, like if you were to do blind taste tests of people that have never tasted Coca-Cola and put it against a bunch of other varieties of drinks, like what are really the chances that people will just like across the board say Coca-Cola is the best drink? Right?
Hmm.
Like I think a lot of it is because of this kind of historical brand recognition that we associate with that taste and with that drink and with that name. And by those like technically objective measures, there's probably a lot of drinks that are way better tasting than Coca-Cola, but either we don't know about it or we don't even care after tasting them because we still want our Coca-Cola, you know?
Yeah. Wow. And so I think about like maybe we'll ask some of our users and kind of think about right now, like, what are you guys worried about some of this like AI stuff that's coming down the pipeline? I'm curious what you guys are thinking right now. I mean, we presented a lot of different things, that are kind of top of mind, from like the Mythos model, us not getting access to it. But then in parallel, GPT 5.5, GPT 5.5 Pro, having some capabilities, if something that's even smarter at it than, the current Mythos reported stuff. And then we talked a lot about earlier, it's like some data centers build out. So if we take these concepts and the powerful things of these models and even then scale them up to their max capacity, then who still is the entire world going to be able to use these things? And even if you do, then like, what is your differentiating factor? I think to me, the way that I'm looking at it is just trying to figure out what are some of the hardest problems, just like that person who was that doctor who was using these models to come up with breakthroughs. Like, what are some of those cool avenues where, like, oh, wow, I can use some of my strengths plus some of these intelligence and then just start pointing it at this problem and seeing if I can kind of dig deeper here to provide, more value for everyone, in terms of like trying to use these things. And I think it's an interesting concept too that, I don't feel like, like the permanent underclass thing is kind of like a funny little like a way to talk about you know uh, what people are seeing in terms of divides of things. But I think, like you're saying, it's going to affect more third world countries than it would like people in like first world countries because of just how much access we already have already. I mean, even just like the phone by itself being able to run a local model, right? Like, not a lot of people have an iPhone. Like, I think it's in other countries and stuff like that, and those have enough processing power to run some of those models already. And um,
Mhm.
with
Yeah,
demands and shortages, yeah, yeah,
even the amount of people that could pay a $20 per month ChatGPT subscription. Like, I mean, I think it's a really good thing that OpenAI did kind of set the standard with the release of ChatGPT of having like this free version available, because that does kind of pressure everybody else to also have a free version available. But like you do get this significantly better capability with that $20 per month subscription, and especially if you're an expert in some type of field, or especially if you're doing something in the sciences and STEM at all, there's a lot of benefits you can get from just kind of amplifying your own abilities through the model, and help you learn things much more effectively, do things much better and faster. And that $20 per month subscription, I mean, it's unfortunate, but it's also true. It's it's not everybody that could afford that. It's the minority, I think, of the world population that can afford that. And if you are even just of average or median US salary or wealth, like, you're in that minority of people. You're in that, I think it's literally median or average US salary is like in the top 2% of world salary. It's
interesting.
like a teacher's salary is up there. It's
That's
insane, yeah.
fascinating. Wow. Yeah, for the world. It's interesting here. It says AI is definitely gonna remove jobs, but people forget about Jevons paradox. Maybe speak on that a little
Yeah,
bit. Yeah.
yeah. Jevons paradox being, when you have things become more efficient, they become used even more. And so maybe he's trying to apply, or maybe the commenter means it in a human context specifically. Maybe he means it like, as human work becomes more efficient, then human work becomes even more needed,
Hmm.
which is also kind of similar in a way to like the comparative advantage thing I was mentioning earlier.
Hmm.
But yeah, I think that will continue to be true even as hardware and algorithmic advances make AI much more efficient. Hopefully, it makes it efficient even faster than I expect it to.
Yeah.
But yeah, a lot of unpredictabilities there. Yeah.
This is an interesting comment about expectations go higher. I mean, I feel this already from AI coding, right? I don't know anyone who's going back to GPT-4 right now and just saying, I'm just going to use the GPT-4 model for X task. Everyone choose the latest and greatest. Um, maybe they'll have an open model, but even the open models are better than that, right? I don't know. What is your thinking around this too? Yo, LDJ?
Oh, sorry, I
Okay.
was accidentally muted. Yeah. There's a Sam Altman quote on this note that you're saying.
Mhm.
A lot of people have mixed feelings about him, but I think this quote's at least pretty good. He mentioned a couple of years ago, he said, one day you'll walk up to a piece of glass, you'll ask for something to be created that would normally take at least weeks or months of work, and it'll be done in minutes, and you'll complain why it doesn't take 30 seconds instead. and and I mean, I think we're literally like on the precipice of basically that thing. Like it's, I mean, right now I sometimes make these applications that would have definitely at least taken me days, and it takes like a couple hours, and I try to be pretty appreciative. But sometimes when it's usually taking me like a couple hours and instead it takes me 10 hours, I'm like,
Mhm.
oh man, why is it being so bad right now? But I still kind of forget that it otherwise would have at least taken me days or longer to do that same thing. Yeah.
Um, I think lastly, I wanted to touch a little bit about the podcast that was talked about in this, or like this last topic here about like in the supply with Dylan Patel. You haven't seen this is a really good interview. And a last part I think he talks about was just kind of like public predictions and the public backlash because people are going to want to blame AI for, like maybe their jobs being gone or whatever. And
Hmm.
it sounds low key dystopian, but I mean, how do you see that? Is this like a real thing, or we're just kind of be all adjusting in real time? Like, I feel like there's going to be way more other constraints to worry about other than AI taking jobs because just the capacity itself. And like in that podcast, he said that memory prices are probably going to double, triple, quadruple, or go even higher than what they are. If we think they're high now, just like kind of get ready because
Hmm.
these are still valuable. And he just lays out the case. And my mouth was on the floor. I'm like, damn it, I should have bought like 10 of those 512 Mac
Yeah.
Studios and I bought 0. Like I was waiting for the order and I was like, it's gone. It's like, oh, no. And I'm not trying to incite FOMO here or anything, but I kind of want to
Hmm.
get your perspective on this. Like, how should I ground my thinking here? If there's hardware
Yeah.
that's available now, should I start getting it for myself so that I have something? But I feel like I'm in such a small sliver of users because like I am an engineer and I want to tinker and I want to, learn more about this stuff. But
Hmm.
is that even worth my time? Is it just better to just lease, some GPUs for X amount of dollars an hour and have the latest and greatest there or something like that? Or is everyone going to be doing that too? Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. So on the note of like Dylan Patel's analysis of the supply chain and everything, I don't think I could really do much better than him on that. That's his like bread and butter. He spent so much time focus on that and is really good at it.
Hmm.
But I think what's maybe worth adding nuance to is like what is like actual kind of bulk direct pricing versus what you might see on like eBay right now or something.
Uh-huh.
So what you might see on eBay, which I think is more detached from what Dylan is probably talking about,
Mm,
is like those types of second and third hand pricings of like resellers and stuff. I think a lot of that is very much a toilet paper effect. It's like people rush and surging into their purchasing of like RAM sticks even though they don't need it,
I see.
explicitly for the purpose of reselling because they anticipate that there will be like a drastic crunch on supply.
Uh,
I think I think that has maybe actually already come down a little bit. Like I
mm,
think from the peak of what RAM prices have been in the past few months, I think it has come down a bit from that peak, and I think might come down a little bit further from that peak.
mm,
But from like the original RAM prices, like I don't know, I guess what like I mean RAM prices have always kind of fluctuated, but a couple years ago, let's say,
yeah.
yeah, it might be like another 2 or 3 years from now, maybe until we see those prices again, maybe even more.
Mm,
Um,
wow.
yeah, it is hard to say exactly, but yeah, hopefully, like there's some new companies like Substrate and I think a Rapidus in Japan and different companies trying to basically be new competitors in the lithography market. So like the machines to make chips, as well as the use of those machines to make chips, which is what ASML is doing the former, TSMC is doing the latter. Yeah, there is some competition that might become serious competition in that area by 2028ish, 2029.
Mm.
But keyword might. Yeah, like
Might.
both of these, like these efforts might completely crash, and ASML and TSMC still end up being like basically monopolies. But
Yeah.
uh, yeah, I think it's very exciting though, because let's say even if Rapidus and Substrate fail, which are kind of like those main two companies I was mentioning,
Hmm.
there's like people literally just using GPT 5.5 Pro to like try and make new advancements and putting those advancements into the world or different things like that, or
Yeah.
ASML and TSMC themselves doing innovation with these models, which to a degree they have already been actually using AI in their processes for the past few years. But I mean, this will be, I think, to another level, and the rate at acceleration that we'll see on the physical hardware process here, I think it could be very high. Yeah.
That, yeah, and if you have these little mini Karpathy loops, right? That can
Yeah,
just,
exactly.
yeah,
And then the efficiency which you could produce RAM,
yeah,
or the amount of silicon you actually need to make like a certain capacity or bandwidth of RAM, that might go dramatically down. And then you have like
mhm,
these small little cheap RAM sticks that maybe have better even or equal capabilities to our current RAM, but is
yeah.
like way cheaper and can be produced at way higher rates, etc.
Interesting. Um, Last thing I was thinking about that's on my mind, because you've had dealt with model training and stuff back in the day, and
Hmm.
something I just kind of don't have a lot of color on is the perspective of, and there's not a lot of public information, but Cursor's Composer 2, and then people were thinking was trained on Kimi, and they found out and kind of released some of that information.
Hmm.
And what I'm trying to kind of understand here is that type of training and like that a specialty thing, is that something that other companies should be getting into more often, like for their specific skill sets? For example, like in the insurance industry or in law or in like these different verticals, right? Like if you create a space where these people basically give you the information, and you give them the benefit of hooking up tool sets and strings of things together, um, is that going to be kind of like the future where some of these companies should be going towards, like not data collection, but just training models that can output stuff better and faster and so forth with this type of, bandwidth or compute?
Yeah, I think this is one of the biggest questions really right now,
Mm.
and it does have a lot of uncertainty. But I guess something I could say on this note is Cursor does have some quite talented people on their team, especially as they've gotten notoriety and so many people using their service over the past few years. They've
Mm.
been able to convince a lot of smart and very talented people to come onto their talent dense team, and I think that was a big part of why they were able to do Composer 1.5 and Composer 2 as well as they did.
I see.
But more broadly, it's I think the main companies like Anthropic and OpenAI, which I feel like they're the main top two that are kind of ahead of everybody else at the moment. They're clearly very focused on like the state of the art, the best models, the most powerful models. You have 5.5 Pro and 5.5 release. They have released like a 5.5, or sorry, they have released like GPT-5 Mini and GPT-5 Nano before, but
Mhm.
they did not release, at least not yet, like a 5.5, a 5.5 Mini and
Ooh.
5.5 Nano.
Uh-huh.
And likewise with Claude, you have Opus 4.6 and Opus 4.7, but there has not yet been, at least last I checked, a Haiku 4.6, and not even a Sonnet 4.7 yet either.
Interesting.
And
Hmm.
so I think that does kind of leave that gap. Like, okay, if these companies are focused on that frontier, like even if you're technically a little bit behind the frontier in terms of overall advancement and everything, you might really be able to have something more focused on like efficiency and being like a little bit worse, but like really fast and like really cheap, and really being able to compete on that front. And in part, that's what companies also kind of like Quen and Kimi have arguably been doing to an extent as well, which is why so many people use those models for things like OpenClaw.
I
Uh,
see.
it's not just, oh, I love China, I want to use these, these models. It's a lot of people just literally, it's just good bang for your buck.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a little worse, but a lot of people choose to use it.
That's fascinating because Anthropic clearly wants you to pay for that type of use case, and
Mhm.
OpenAI is like, come on, come one, come all, and then others are like, well, I'd rather not pay either of those companies. I just want to get the cheapest. I don't care. I just have this use case, and or I want to run it at home eventually or something like that. So that's interesting thing. Yeah, no, I think this was just a really interesting discussion, and I want to try to do more of these. And I feel like if you're watching and you want to see more of this, especially more of LDJ, drop it in the comments and let us know, because I feel like there's landscape of AI is so confusing. And whenever I try to get information on YouTube or in other sources, I'm trying to weed through the hype, and then I find out they're just literally reading a blog post. I'm like, come on, like, who are the real engineers who are working in this, space, and who are doing things? And LDJ has a lot of really great history here, and so I'm honored to have you, on the show. And you can also check out LDJ, also featured on Thursday AI every week with Alex Volkov, THURSDAI. And you guys talk a lot about the latest model releases, open source stuff to what's been released as well, and it kind of shares your opinions there. And where else can they find you, LDJ?
I have one post on my blog right now, but I plan to release some more. I have a website, ldj.ai, really simple domain, that when I post kind of my next batch of blogs and everything, and then make those public, I'll be sure to have a link to my blog on here on ldj.ai, or I might just have them directly on the site itself. And there's a few other projects, like I'm not sure if you showed it during the stream actually, Ray, but the calc.ldj.ai.
Oh yeah,
And
see that.
I made a training calculator that I posted up on Twitter a while ago, but this is kind of a revamped version I made here. And I'm gonna add some extra features and improvements, but this is kind of one of the projects I have up, and I'll have some other projects directly on the main site. But this is just an example of something that might help people get an intuition and also help plan whether it's a small or big model training project, and seeing, okay, how much would that roughly cost? How much flops is that? What is the memory capacity? What is the trade-off between how long it would take versus how many GPUs you would need at any given moment? And I just plan to put out some other small useful things like that for people.
Wow, this is super cool, and a lot of people are definitely interested and wanting to see more for sure. So this is really cool. Shout outs to Angelina, shout outs to Stephen King, shout out to everyone who's been kind of tuning in. I think this has been really great. We'll definitely get some more of LDJ here on the show, and I think another thing that we were going to talk about, so that you stay tuned for the next episode, is going a little bit deeper on DeepSeek V4. And there's a lot of hype around this model right now. A lot of people are talking about this. And I think there's a lot of people that are still trying to parse out this paper. It's a massive paper with a lot of interesting techniques here that, can apply to different places. And I think for right now, all I'm seeing online are just a bunch of hot takes, but I'm interested in scratching beyond that, and going a little bit deeper and saying, like, this attention sink, like what's, what's going on with this, or like, what does this actually translate to? And more for like, what type of efficiencies are people going to pick up in, the models downstream? Because usually when something that's open source like that, that has a lot of well-researched information, and people are now trying to prove that this information is true, all of that stuff tends to get folded back into the current state of the art models, especially for stuff regarding long context, or being able to take, 1/5 or 1/20th the size of things they used to do now, and do more with it. So I'm super curious to see what that's all about, and curious to see what your take is going to be there, LDJ. And we're not going to rush you or something. Whenever the time is right, when you feel like everything's ready to be there, definitely let us know. And yeah, us as this person says, I like to read the blogs and other companies' posts here too. I find it interesting would be if AI could be the same instance always. That's cool. That's cool. Yeah. No, I appreciate everyone who's been able to kind of join in on the stream and kind of leave the comments. And I like the live stream format because it just allows you to show up as well. So this like Sunday stream is kind of like a casual thing. I might actually make it a regular thing and try to get some other folks on as well. I'm just kind of an experiment that I'm kind of playing around with. But normally I now stream on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So be sure to check out the schedules there. I think I tend to go like live in the morning at 9 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. And so, yeah, LDJ, thank you so much for coming on the show, and excited to have you on for the next one and see what you've been cooking, man.
Yeah, and thanks for having me on. I'm excited to be on next time as well, and we'll talk about DeepSeek, just like poetically our last conversation was actually DeepSeek v3, so that'll be
Yes.
nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool, man. Awesome. Take it easy, y'all, and have a happy Sunday. And we will see you guys very, very soon. See you Tuesday, y'all. Peace.